March 1945. Here is a statistic that will shock you. Over 425,000 German prisoners of war were held in camps across the United States during World War II. But here is what they never taught you in history class. Thousands of those prisoners were women. Nurses, telephone operators, factory workers, teachers captured as Allied forces swept through Europe. And here is the twist that makes this story absolutely insane. Many of these German women raised on a steady diet of Nazi propaganda, telling them that black people were subhuman savages, were guarded by African American soldiers in the segregated American South. Women like Greta Hoffmann, a 32-year-old Red Cross nurse from Hamburg who had spent 3 years treating wounded Wehrmacht soldiers from Poland to Normandy. She arrived in Louisiana in the spring of 1945, expecting torture, expecting rape, expecting death. What she found instead would shatter everything she had ever been taught about race, about humanity, about the very nature of good and evil. By the time she left America 9 months later, she would become one of the most unlikely ambassadors of racial reconciliation in post-war Germany. But first, she had to survive the most terrifying train ride of her life. Let me take you back to the spring of 1945. The war in Europe was entering its final bloody chapter. Allied forces had broken through German defenses across multiple fronts. The D-Day invasion of June 1944 had opened the Western Front. Soviet forces were grinding their way toward Berlin from the east. Germany was collapsing, but the collapse was creating a problem nobody had anticipated. Prisoners. Millions of them. By early 1945, Allied forces were capturing German soldiers and civilians at a rate that overwhelmed every contingency plan. Makeshift holding camps in France and Belgium were bursting at the seams. Disease was spreading. Food was running short. The logistics of managing this human tide threatened to slow the Allied advance toward Berlin. American military planners faced an impossible choice. They could divert precious resources to managing prisoners in Europe, potentially prolonging the war. Or they could ship prisoners across the Atlantic to camps in the United States, freeing up manpower and supplies for the final push. They chose option 2. Between 1944 and 1946, nearly 500,000 German prisoners were transported to over 500 camps scattered across the American heartland. Texas, Kansas. Louisiana, Arizona. Places most Germans had never heard of. Places that might as well have been the dark side of the moon. But here is where the story gets complicated. America in 1945 was a deeply segregated nation. Jim Crow laws enforced strict racial separation across the South. Black Americans could not vote, could not eat in white restaurants, could not drink from white water fountains. The military itself was segregated. Black soldiers served in separate units often assigned to support roles deemed less prestigious by white commanders. Guard duty at prisoner of war camps fell into this category. It was considered unglamorous work, far from the glory of combat. And so, in a twist of historical irony that seems almost too perfect to be true, the United States Army assigned thousands of African American soldiers to guard German prisoners who had been taught that black people were the lowest form of human life. Nobody planned this as a social experiment. Nobody anticipated what would happen when Nazi ideology collided with American reality. But something extraordinary was about to unfold in the pine forests of Louisiana. Greta Hoffmann was not a Nazi. At least that is what she told herself. She had never joined the party. She had never attended the rallies in Nuremberg. She had simply done her job, treating wounded soldiers in field hospitals as the Wehrmacht advanced and then retreated across Europe. But Greta had absorbed the ideology nonetheless. It was impossible not to. From childhood, she had been taught that Germans were the master race, that Jews were parasites destroying civilization, that black people were primitive creatures barely removed from apes. These beliefs were not presented as opinions. They were presented as scientific facts, backed by academics, endorsed by doctors, reinforced by every institution of German society. Greta had seen the propaganda films showing African American soldiers as rapists and murderers. She had seen the posters depicting black men as guerrillas in American uniforms with captions reading, "This is what liberates you." She had no reason to question these images. She had never met a black person in her life. When Greta was captured in late February 1945, she fully expected to die. Nazi propaganda had been clear on this point. Americans showed no mercy to Germans who had served the Reich. Women would be violated and murdered. Men would be worked to death in labor camps. The horrors that Germany had inflicted on others would be repaid tenfold. Instead, Greta received a medical examination delousing powder and a gray cotton dress stamped with the letters PW in black paint. Prisoner of war. The letters felt like a brand burned into her skin. She was loaded onto a transport ship with 200 other German women. Teachers, telephone operators, factory workers, even a violinist from the Hamburg Philharmonic. They crossed the Atlantic in darkness, seasick, terrified, praying to a god they were no longer sure existed. Greta kept a diary, hiding it in her sleeve, writing by moonlight through portholes. March 12, 1945. We are told we go to America. I cannot imagine what America will do to us. The ship docked in New Orleans in late March. The women stumbled down the gangplank into heat unlike anything they had ever experienced. Not the dry heat of German summers, but something wet and alive pressing against skin-filling lungs with thickness. And there, waiting on the dock, were their guards. Black men in American uniforms. Try to imagine this moment. You have been taught your entire life that black people are subhuman. You have seen films depicting them as savage beasts. You have been told they will rape you, murder you, tear you apart like animals. And now, you are standing on a dock in a foreign country, exhausted, terrified, completely at the mercy of these same people. What Greta saw on that New Orleans dock did not compute. The black soldiers stood in perfect formation. Their uniforms were pressed despite the brutal heat. Their weapons were held with professional ease, no threat in their posture, no menace in their eyes. They looked exactly like soldiers. American soldiers. One soldier, his skin dark as tobacco leaves, stepped forward to help an elderly German woman who had stumbled on the gangplank. His hand was gentle. His voice was calm. He steadied her like she was his own grandmother, then returned to formation without a word. Greta watched this small act of kindness and felt something crack in her understanding of the world. It was the first crack of many. The women were loaded onto open-sided trucks for the journey north. They drove through landscape unlike anything in Germany. Endless flatness broken by strange trees draped in gray moss that hung like spectral curtains. Swamps and bayous and rivers the color of rust. A world that seemed both beautiful and dangerous, alive with sounds they could not identify. The black soldiers driving the trucks did not speak to them, but their silence was not cruel. They simply drove, occasionally passing water canteens back when the heat became unbearable. One soldier, noticing a woman about to faint, stopped the entire convoy in shade until she recovered. These small acts of human decency confused the prisoners more than cruelty would have. Cruelty would have confirmed everything they believed. Kindness from people they had been taught to fear was impossible to process. The camp emerged from pine woods like something from a fever dream. Rows of white wooden barracks stretched across cleared land. Guard towers stood at intervals, but the guards inside read newspapers and smoked cigarettes. They looked bored. And standing on the headquarters steps, waiting to receive them, was the camp commander. Captain Robert Hayes, a black man commanding white prisoners. In 1945, this would have been unthinkable in most of America, let alone Nazi Germany. Captain Hayes stood ramrod straight in his immaculate uniform, his face revealing nothing as the trucks pulled in. He had served in North Africa and Italy. He had earned his rank through combat and competence, and now he had been assigned to command a prisoner of war camp in the Louisiana pine forests, far from the glory of the front lines. Some might have seen this assignment as an insult. Hayes saw it as an opportunity. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention," he said through a translator. His voice was steady, formal, absolutely professional. "You will work. You will be paid. You will be fed. You will not be harmed. Follow the rules and you will find life here tolerable." The German women stood in formation, sun beating down, trying to process these words. Paid, fed, not harmed. It had to be a trick. Some elaborate American deception before the real punishment began. Frau Kessler, an older woman who had served as an administrator in the German War Ministry, muttered under her breath, "This is how they break you, with comfort, with kindness. Then comes the punishment." But the punishment never came. The barracks were simple but clean, wooden bunks with thin mattresses, lockers for personal items they did not have, screens on windows to keep out insects, fans that moved the heavy air. In the corner of each barracks, a radio played American music, big band jazz, voices singing in English about moonlight and romance. Morning roll call came at 5 a.m. The women filed into the mess hall expecting watery soup and stale bread. The starvation rations that defined wartime Europe. Instead, they found trays loaded with scrambled eggs, bacon, toast with real butter, coffee with cream. Greta stared at her plate as if it might vanish. Around her, women sat frozen, afraid to touch the food. One woman began to cry. Back in Germany, civilians were eating potato peels and sawdust bread. Here, prisoners ate like kings. The first week passed in a blur of confusion and cognitive dissonance. The women worked 8-hour shifts in laundries and kitchens. They received breaks and water and treatment that corrected mistakes without cruelty. And always, everywhere, the black soldiers were present. They played baseball in the evenings, their laughter carrying across the compound. They wrote letters home in the shade of pine trees. They sang while working harmonies that seemed to come from somewhere ancient and profound. One soldier carved wooden toys during his breaks. Horses, dogs, tiny birds with wings spread wide. Nothing matched what the women had been taught. Nothing. Greta began keeping detailed notes in her diary. She recorded every interaction, every observation, every moment that contradicted Nazi propaganda. She was compiling evidence without knowing exactly why. Perhaps she needed to prove to herself that this was real. Perhaps she needed documentation for when the cruelty finally began. But the cruelty never came. Instead, something far more dangerous began to happen. Greta began to question everything she had ever believed, and she was not alone. Across the camp, in whispered conversations in the barracks and stolen glances during work details in the quiet hours before sleep, German women were confronting an impossible truth. They had been lied to. About black people. About America. About everything. But this was only the beginning. The real transformation would require something more than observation. It would require connection. In Part 2, we will see what happened when Greta Hoffmann began talking to her guards. When a sergeant named James Wilson sat down under a pine tree and asked her what exactly the Nazis had taught her about black people. When she answered honestly, and he responded with something she never expected: understanding. We will witness the moment when German women heard jazz music for the first time and felt their hatred dissolve into tears. We will see what happened when letters from home revealed that being a prisoner in Louisiana was safer than being free in Germany. And we will discover the price that black soldiers paid for showing mercy to enemies who had wanted them dead. Because here is the question that haunted Camp Concordia. Can compassion defeat ideology? Can human decency overcome a lifetime of propaganda? And if it can, what does that mean for all of us? The answers changed lives. They changed history. They might even change you. In Part 1, we witnessed something impossible. German women prisoners raised on Nazi propaganda depicting black people as subhuman savages arrived at Camp Concordia in Louisiana to find themselves guarded by African American soldiers. Women like Greta Hoffmann, a 32-year-old Red Cross nurse, expected torture and death. Instead, she found pressed uniforms, professional conduct, and scrambled eggs for breakfast. Everything she had been taught about race began to crack. But observation alone cannot destroy a lifetime of indoctrination. Here is a statistic that will haunt you. Studies after the war showed that over 60% of German prisoners returned home with their Nazi beliefs intact. The camps fed them, housed them, treated them well, and sent them back to rebuild Germany with the same poisonous ideology that had started the war. So what made Camp Concordia different? What transformed Greta Hoffmann from a passive observer into someone who would spend the rest of her life fighting racism in Germany? The answer lies in what happened during the third week of April 1945. And it started with a conversation under a pine tree that neither party expected to have. 3 weeks into her captivity, Greta Hoffmann had settled into a routine. Morning roll call at 5 a.m. Breakfast in the mess hall. 8 hours of work in the camp laundry. Evening free time before lights out at 9 p.m. The physical conditions were better than anything she had experienced in the final year of the war. But something was wrong. The German women had divided themselves into factions. The largest group, led by Frau Kessler, maintained strict Nazi discipline. They spoke only German. They refused to acknowledge the Black Guards as human beings. They held secret meetings in the barracks, reinforcing each other's beliefs, insisting that this comfortable captivity was merely a temporary humiliation before Germany's inevitable victory. "We must remain pure," Frau Kessler announced one evening. "The Americans think they can break us with kindness. They think we will forget who we are. But we are German women. We do not fraternize with subhumans." Greta sat on her bunk listening. 2 months ago, she would have nodded along. Now the words felt hollow. She had watched Private Marcus Brown teach Lisa Mueller to play baseball, his patience infinite, his laughter genuine. She had seen Sergeant Wilson carry water to women who had collapsed from heat exhaustion. She had observed dozens of small kindnesses that propaganda said were impossible. But she said nothing. The social pressure was too strong. Speaking against Frau Kessler meant ostracism, meant being labeled a traitor, meant spending the rest of her captivity in isolation. So Greta stayed silent, caught between what she had been taught and what she was seeing with her own eyes. Captain Robert Hayes noticed the division. He had commanded this camp for 6 months, and he had seen this pattern before. German prisoners arrived terrified, then relieved, then settled into comfortable routines that allowed them to maintain their beliefs untouched. They ate American food, worked American jobs, lived under American protection, and still believed themselves superior to the black men guarding them. It was, Hayes thought, a perfect metaphor for something he knew all too well. You could change laws without changing hearts. You could force compliance without creating understanding. True transformation required something more dangerous. It required contact. Sergeant James Wilson had not planned to become a philosopher. He had grown up picking cotton in rural Georgia, the grandson of slaves, the son of sharecroppers who worked land they would never own. He had joined the army in 1941, believing that fighting fascism abroad might somehow help defeat racism at home. 4 years later, he was not so sure. He had fought in North Africa. He had bled in Italy. He had watched white soldiers receive medals for actions that earned black soldiers nothing but reassignment to support duties. And now he was guarding German women who looked through him like he was furniture. But Wilson was also a reader. He had taught himself from discarded books, from newspapers left behind by white officers, from anything with words that he could find. He understood something that many of his fellow soldiers did not. Hatred was not natural. It was taught. And anything taught could be untaught. He began watching Greta Hoffmann during her work shifts. She was different from the others. She did not look through him. She looked at him with an expression he recognized. Confusion. Curiosity. The first cracks of doubt. One evening in late April, Wilson made a decision that violated every unwritten rule of the camp. He sat down on a bench near the pine tree where Greta was writing in her diary. Not too close. Not threatening. Just present. "You write a lot," he said. His English was clear. Educated, nothing like the dialect the Germans expected from Black Americans. Greta looked up, startled. Her English was limited, but she understood. "Yes," she said carefully. "I write what I see." "And what do you see?" Wilson asked. The question hung in the humid air. Greta could have said nothing. She could have walked away, reported the conversation to Frau Kessler, maintained her position in the German hierarchy. Instead, she told the truth. "I see things that should not exist," she said. "I see things that everything I was taught says are impossible." Wilson nodded slowly. "Then maybe everything you were taught was wrong." This simple statement hit Greta like a physical blow. Wrong. The word echoed in her mind. If what she had been taught about black people was wrong, what else was wrong? The superiority of the German race, the necessity of the war, the camps she had heard rumors about but refused to believe. What would it mean if everything was wrong? They met again the next evening, and the evening after that. Always at the same pine tree, always at a respectful distance, always with the awareness that they were crossing lines that both their societies had drawn. Wilson asked her questions. Not accusations, not lectures, just questions. "What did they tell you about black people in Germany?" Greta hesitated, then decided that lies would be pointless. "They told us you were not fully human," she said. "They showed us films of black soldiers committing atrocities. They said you were evidence that democracy leads to racial chaos." Wilson absorbed this without visible reaction. He had heard it before. "And what do you think now?" "I think the films were lies, but I do not understand why. Why would our government lie about something so easy to disprove?" Wilson's laugh was short, bitter. "Because lies work. You believe what you're told if you never meet the people being lied about. Your government knew most Germans would never see a black person in their lives, so they could say whatever they wanted." Greta considered this. In Hamburg, where she had grown up, she had never seen anyone who was not white. Black people existed only in propaganda films, in newspapers, in the warnings of teachers and officials. She had believed because she had no evidence to the contrary. But now, she had evidence. She was looking at it. Wilson continued. "You know what's funny? Here in America, they tell similar lies about us. That we're lazy, stupid, dangerous. That we can't be trusted with responsibility. That we don't feel things the way white people do." He gestured at the camp around them. "And here I am, commanding respect from men who fought across Europe, responsible for hundreds of prisoners, doing a job they said black men couldn't do. Because the lies work both ways. They work until they don't." Greta felt something shifting in her chest. A wall she had not known existed was developing cracks. "You have been treated terribly by your own country," she said slowly. "And yet you treat us with dignity." Why Wilson was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was softer. "Because somebody has to break the cycle. Hatred just makes more hatred. Revenge just makes more revenge. Somewhere somebody has to choose different." He looked directly at her. "My grandmother was a slave. She was beaten, raped, treated worse than an animal. She had every reason to hate white people until her dying day. You know what she told me instead? She said hate will eat you alive. She said the only way to survive is to find the human in everyone, even the ones who don't see the human in you." Greta felt tears forming. She did not fully understand why. "That is," she searched for the English word that is impossible. "I could not do that." Wilson shrugged. "Maybe you could. Maybe that's why you're sitting here talking to me instead of sitting with the others pretending I don't exist." The observation was so accurate that Greta could not respond. She was different. She had always been different. Even in Germany, she had felt slightly out of step with the certainty around her. She had asked questions that annoyed her teachers. She had wondered about things she was told not to wonder about. And now, in a prisoner of war camp in Louisiana, talking to a black American sergeant under a pine tree, she was finally finding words for the doubt she had carried her entire life. The conversations continued through May. Other women began to notice. Lisa Mueller joined them one evening, curious. despite her fear of Frau Kessler's disapproval. Then 2 more women, then 5. Wilson brought other soldiers into the conversations. Private Marcus Brown, who had grown up in Chicago and could explain jazz music. Corporal David Washington, who had studied chemistry before the war and could discuss science with the German teachers. Sergeant Thomas Reed, the pianist from the camp band who played Beethoven one evening and watched German women weep at the familiar notes coming from black fingers. Each conversation was a small revolution. Each interaction was a crack in the wall of ideology. The German women began asking questions they had never dared ask before. If black people could play, Beethoven could discuss chemistry, could command respect. What else had they been lied to about? And if the lies about race were false, what about the other lies? What about the camps in the East that everyone whispered about, but nobody acknowledged? What about the Jews who had disappeared from German cities? What about everything? In early June, Captain Hayes made a decision that would later be seen as either brilliant or reckless. He authorized a camp-wide concert. The black soldiers would perform jazz music. The German prisoners would be invited to attend. It would be the first time in the camp's history that guards and prisoners gathered for something other than work or roll call. Frau Kessler was furious. "This is fraternization," she hissed during a barracks meeting. "This is exactly what they want. They want to make us forget who we are. They want to contaminate us with their degenerate culture. We will not attend." But when the evening of the concert arrived, over half the German women walked to the camp square anyway. Greta was among them. Lisa Muller, the young telephone operators, the teachers, even the violinist from Hamburg, who had not touched an instrument since her capture. They sat on wooden benches in the Louisiana evening fireflies beginning to pulse in the gathering darkness, and waited. Leon Davis raised his saxophone. The first notes cut through the humid air like something alive. The melody started slow, mournful, carrying centuries of sorrow in its phrases. This was not the chaotic noise of Nazi propaganda films. This was architecture. Complex, sophisticated, requiring incredible skill and emotional depth. The music built layer upon layer. Thomas Reed's piano joined in, then the drums, then a trumpet that seemed to reach toward heaven. The German women sat frozen, unable to reconcile what they were hearing with what they had been taught. Lisa Muller began to cry. She would later write in her own diary that the music seemed to reach past every defense she had built, past every wall of ideology, straight to something fundamental about being human. It was grief transformed into beauty. It was suffering transformed into art. It was proof that the people she had been taught to despise were not only human, but capable of creating something she had never heard in the concert halls of Munich. When the last note faded, there was silence. Then, hesitantly, applause. It grew. German women who had been taught that black culture was degenerate were clapping for black musicians who had just created something transcendent. Leon Davis opened his eyes. He saw the women applauding. He nodded once, a small acknowledgement, and began to pack up his saxophone. That night, Greta wrote in her diary, "Today, I heard the music of people we were taught to despise. It was more beautiful than anything I heard in Berlin. I understand now that we were lied to about everything. Not small lies, but lies so large they built an entire world. And now that world is collapsing. I do not know what will replace it, but I know it must be something better." June turned to July. The conversations under the pine tree had become a regular gathering. Sometimes a dozen women sitting with half a dozen soldiers talking about everything. About music, about family, about the war, about what they hoped for when it was all over. The wall between guard and prisoner was dissolving, but it was not dissolving evenly. Frau Kessler's faction grew smaller, but more bitter. They began reporting the conversations to camp authorities demanding punishment for fraternization. They accused Greta and the others of being race traitors, of betraying Germany, of surrendering to enemy propaganda. Captain Hayes reviewed the reports and filed them without action. Nothing in the Geneva Convention prohibited conversation. Nothing in his orders required him to maintain ideological separation between prisoners and guards. If anything, what was happening in Camp Concordia was exactly what the occupation of Germany would need. People learning to see past propaganda, hearts changing not just behaviors. But Hayes also knew this could not last forever. The war in Europe was over. Japan would fall soon. And when it did, these women would be sent home to a destroyed Germany that needed to be rebuilt. The question was, what they would bring with them. Would they bring the old hatred, the old ideology, the old certainty that some humans were more human than others? Or would they bring something new? In August, news arrived that changed everything. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Japan's surrender. The war was truly over. And with that news came another announcement that sent shockwaves through Camp Concordia. Repatriation would begin in October. The German women would be sent home. Greta received this news with mixed emotions. She wanted to see her family, wanted to know if her sister in Hamburg had survived. But she was also afraid. Afraid of what waited in the ruins of Germany. Afraid of being pulled back into the old ways by people who had not experienced what she had experienced. Afraid that everything she had learned would dissolve like morning mist when confronted with the reality of post-war survival. And then, 3 days before her scheduled departure, something happened that would test everything she had come to believe. Letters arrived from Germany. Letters describing horrors she had refused to imagine. Letters confirming that the rumors about the camps were not rumors at all. Letters that would force her to confront the ultimate question. How do you rebuild a life when everything you believed has been proven not just wrong, but monstrous? In Part 3, we will see what those letters contained. We will watch Greta Hoffmann face the truth about what her country had done while she looked away. We will witness the final conversations between prisoners and guards, the words exchanged before departure, the promises made, and the doubts that remained. And we will discover what happened when these transformed women returned to a Germany that did not want to hear what they had learned. Because changing your own heart is one thing. Changing a nation is something else entirely, and the real battle was just beginning. In Parts 1 and 2, we witnessed a transformation that should have been impossible. German women prisoners arrived at Camp Concordia expecting savagery from Black American soldiers. Instead, they found dignity, professionalism, and kindness that shattered every lie they had been taught. Greta Hoffmann and dozens of other women began talking with their guards, attending jazz concerts, questioning everything they had believed about race and humanity. The wall of Nazi ideology was cracking. But cracks are not collapse. Doubt is not conviction. And the hardest truth was still waiting to be confronted. In August 1945, letters began arriving from Germany. Letters that contained information so horrifying that many women refused to believe them. Letters describing what had really happened in the camps that everyone had whispered about, but nobody acknowledged. Here is the statistic that will haunt this entire chapter. 6 million Jews murdered. Millions more Slavs, Roma, disabled people, political prisoners. Industrial-scale extermination carried out by ordinary Germans, while ordinary Germans looked away. The women of Camp Concordia were about to learn that questioning racism was the easy part. The hard part was accepting complicity in genocide. The mail arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in mid-August. Women gathered around the distribution table, hands trembling as they received envelopes bearing German stamps and foreign postmarks. Many had not heard from family in over a year. Some expected to learn that everyone they loved was dead. The reality was worse than death. Greta Hoffmann received 3 letters. One from her sister Ingrid in Hamburg. One from a former colleague at the field hospital. One from her aunt in Bavaria. She read them in order sitting on her bunk while the Louisiana heat pressed through the screened windows. Ingrid's letter described Hamburg in ruins. Allied bombing had destroyed 70% of the city. People lived in basements and rubble. Food was scarce. The British occupation forces were strict but fair. But that was not the worst part. The worst part came in the 3rd paragraph. They are showing us films, Ingrid wrote. Films from the camps. Greta, I cannot describe what I have seen. Mountains of bodies, skeletons in striped uniforms, children. Children. Greta. They killed children. They told us they were relocating the Jews. They told us it was for their own protection. They lied. And we believed them. Or we pretended to believe. I do not know anymore which is worse. Greta's hands began to shake. She read the letter from her colleague next. This one was more clinical, written by a nurse who had treated survivors liberated from Bergen-Belsen. The descriptions were medical, precise, horrifying. Typhus, starvation, bodies stacked like cordwood. Mass graves that had to be bulldozed because there were too many dead to bury individually. Survivors who weighed less than children, their eyes hollow, their minds shattered. The third letter from her aunt was the shortest and the most devastating. Your cousin Wilhelm was a guard at Auschwitz. He killed himself when the Soviets came. We found his diary. I burned it after reading the first 3 pages. I could not finish. I do not know how to live knowing what our family did. Greta sat motionless for a long time. Around her, other women were having similar experiences. Crying, screaming, staring at letters they could not process. One woman tore her letter into pieces, shouting that it was Allied propaganda. Another walked out of the barracks and did not stop walking until guards brought her back from the perimeter fence. The camp descended into chaos. Not physical chaos, not violence, but something worse. Psychological collapse. The comfortable distance these women had maintained from the worst of Nazi crimes was suddenly brutally eliminated. They could no longer pretend they had not known. They could no longer claim ignorance. The evidence was overwhelming, documented, undeniable. And they had to face the question that would define the rest of their lives. What did you do while this was happening? What did you know, and why did you do nothing? Frau Kessler called an emergency meeting that evening. Her voice was sharp, commanding the voice of someone trying to maintain control as everything collapsed. These letters are lies, she announced. Allied propaganda designed to break our spirit. The Americans want us to feel guilty, so we will accept their occupation without resistance. We must not believe them. We must remain strong. Greta stood up. She had never directly challenged Frau Kessler before. She had always been too afraid of social consequences, too uncertain of her own position. But something had changed. The letters had burned away her fear. I knew, Greta said. Her voice was quiet but clear. I knew something was happening to the Jews. I saw them being loaded onto trains. I heard rumors about the camps. I chose not to ask questions. I chose not to know the answers. The barracks went silent. Frau Kessler's face twisted with rage. You are a traitor. You have been corrupted by these subhumans, by their music and their lies. You disgrace every German woman in this camp. Greta did not back down. The subhumans, as you call them, have treated us with more dignity than our own government treated millions of innocent people. The subhumans have fed us, housed us, protected us, while our government was murdering children in gas chambers. She was crying now, but her voice did not waver. We were wrong. About everything. About the Jews, about black people, about the war, about Hitler, about everything. And if we go home and pretend we did not learn this, if we rebuild Germany on the same lies, then all of this suffering meant nothing. Frau Kessler slapped her. The sound echoed through the barracks. Greta did not move. She stood with her cheek reddening, looking directly at the older woman. That is your answer, violence. That is what we learned from 12 years of National Socialism. When someone speaks truth, hit them. When reality contradicts ideology, destroy reality. I will not be silent anymore. I will not pretend anymore. And I will spend the rest of my life making sure Germany never makes these mistakes again. Frau Kessler raised her hand for another blow, but she was surrounded by women who did not move to support her. Women who had read their own letters. Women who had their own doubts, their own questions, their own cracks in the wall. Slowly, Frau Kessler lowered her hand. She looked around the barracks, seeing the shifting loyalties, the uncertain faces, the collapse of her authority. You are all traitors, she said. You will regret this when Germany rises again." She walked to her bunk and did not speak to anyone for 3 days. The faction she had led dissolved that night. Not completely, not all at once, but the center had broken. The women who had maintained Nazi discipline out of social pressure found that the pressure had reversed. Now it was the true believers who were isolated. Now it was the questioners who had numbers on their side. Greta found Sergeant Wilson the next morning. She had not slept. Her eyes were swollen from crying. She sat down on the bench under the pine tree without asking permission. "I need to tell you something," she said. Wilson waited. "When I was in Germany, I knew about the camps. Not everything, but something. I knew Jews were being sent away. I knew they were not coming back. I told myself it was not my concern. I told myself the government must have reasons. I told myself many lies to avoid facing the truth." She paused, gathering strength for what came next. "And I believed what they said about black people. I believed you were inferior, dangerous, not fully human. I believed this easily because it made me feel superior, because it gave me someone to look down on." Wilson listened without interrupting. His face was unreadable. "I cannot undo what I believed. I cannot undo what my country did. But I want you to know that I see now. I see what we were, what I was. And I am more ashamed than I have words for." The silence stretched. Fireflies were beginning their evening dance. The Louisiana sky was turning purple and gold. Finally, Wilson spoke. "Hate is easy. It is the laziest emotion there is. You just point at somebody different and blame them for everything wrong in your life. Do not have to think. Do not have to question. Do not have to look at your own failings." He took a long breath. "Love is harder. Respect is harder. Seeing the humanity in everybody, even people who do not look like you. That takes work. That takes courage." "Do you forgive me?" Greta whispered. Wilson looked at her directly. "That is not for me to decide. The people who died in those camps, the ones who suffered under your government, they are the ones you need forgiveness from. And most of them are gone. Then what do I do? You live different. You teach different. When you go home and people start talking about the old ways, the old beliefs, you speak up. You say no. You say, 'I have seen another way, and it is better.' You become the kind of person who would have hidden Jews in her attic instead of pretending not to notice." He stood to leave, then paused. "You asked me once why we do not just let you suffer. It is because we believe people can change. We believe you can learn. We believe that even after everything, there is still a chance to build something better. Do not make us wrong about that." These words would stay with Greta for the rest of her life. They would become her guiding principle, her answer when people asked why she devoted herself to fighting racism in post-war Germany. Because a black American soldier who had every reason to hate chose to believe in her capacity for change. Because he gave her a chance she did not deserve. Because mercy in the end was more powerful than revenge. In the weeks before repatriation, something remarkable happened at Camp Concordia. The conversations that had begun under the pine tree spread throughout the camp. Women who had never spoken to their guards began tentative exchanges. Questions were asked. Stories were shared. Understanding grew. Captain Hayes noticed the change. He had commanded prisoner of war camps for 2 years, and he had never seen anything like this. German prisoners typically maintained strict separation from their guards. They served their time, followed the rules, and returned home with their beliefs intact. Camp Concordia was different. Here prisoners were actively engaging with the very people they had been taught to hate. Here ideology was crumbling in real time. He called Sergeant Wilson into his office one morning. "What is happening out there?" Hayes asked. Wilson considered the question. "They are learning, sir. The way people learn anything. By experience, by contact, by having their assumptions contradicted by reality." Hayes nodded slowly. "You know this will not last. They go home next month, back to a destroyed country full of people who did not have this experience. What do you think happens then? I think some of them will forget. Some will convince themselves this was all a dream or propaganda or temporary insanity. They will go back to the old ways because the old ways are easier. Wilson paused. But some of them will remember. Some of them will teach their children different. Some of them will speak up when they hear the old lies. And maybe that is enough. Maybe change does not happen all at once. Maybe it happens one person at a time, one conversation at a time, one moment of recognition at a time. Hayes was quiet for a long moment. I have been fighting my whole life for recognition. Fighting to prove that black men can lead, can think, can serve with honor. And now I find myself hoping that German women who wanted us exterminated will carry our message home. He smiled, but there was something sad in it. History has a strange sense of humor, Sergeant. Yes, sir, Wilson agreed. It certainly does. Repatriation orders came in early October. The women of Camp Concordia would be shipped back to Europe on November 3, 1945. They would return to a Germany divided into occupation zones, a Germany in ruins, a Germany trying to rebuild from the ashes of total defeat. Greta Hoffmann spent her last days in Louisiana saying goodbye. To the pine tree, where she had learned to think differently. To the barracks that had become a strange kind of home. To the guards who had shown her that humanity was not determined by race. On her final evening, she found Wilson one last time. I will remember this place, she said. I will remember what you taught me. He shook her hand, formal, but warm. Remember what you learned. I just stood witness while you figured it out yourself. Will you remember me? He considered this. I will remember that people can change, that even after everything there is hope. That is what I will carry. The next morning, trucks came before dawn. Women loaded their few possessions and filed out of the camp gates. Captain Hayes stood at the entrance, saluting as they passed, a small gesture of respect offered even to defeated enemies. As the truck pulled away, Greta looked back at Camp Concordia one last time. She saw the white barracks, the pine trees, the guard towers, where bored soldiers had watched them without cruelty. She saw the place where her entire understanding of the world had been dismantled and rebuilt. She did not know what waited in Germany. She did not know if she would be strong enough to live by what she had learned. She did not know if one person could make any difference in a nation that had lost its soul. But she knew she had to try. Because Sergeant Wilson had believed she could change. Because Captain Hayes had treated her with dignity she did not deserve. Because mercy had been extended when revenge would have been justified. In Part 4, we will see what happened when these transformed women returned to Germany. We will witness Greta Hoffmann's struggle to live differently in a nation that wanted to forget. We will discover the fates of Sergeant Wilson, Captain Hayes, and the other soldiers who had shown their enemies a better way. And we will learn the ultimate lesson of Camp Concordia. That changing hearts is possible, but it is only the beginning. The real work comes after. The real test is whether transformation survives when the pressure to conform becomes overwhelming. This story has one final chapter, and it will change how you think about the possibility of redemption. Let me take you back to where this journey began. German women raised on Nazi propaganda arrived at a prisoner of war camp in Louisiana expecting torture and death. Instead, they found black American soldiers who treated them with dignity they did not deserve. Women like Greta Hoffmann spent 9 months having every belief shattered by simple human contact. They attended jazz concerts that moved them to tears. They had conversations under pine trees that dismantled walls of ideology brick by brick. They read letters from home that revealed the full horror of what their country had done. And then in November 1945, they boarded ships back to a destroyed Germany, carrying something fragile and precious inside them. A new understanding of humanity that had been forged in the most unlikely place on earth. But here is what nobody tells you about transformation. The moment of change is not the hard part. The hard part is what comes after. The hard part is living differently when everyone around you wants to forget. The hard part is holding on to truth when lies are more comfortable. This final chapter will answer the question that has been building for 90 minutes. Did any of it matter? Did the lessons of Camp Concordia survive the journey home? And what happened to the people who taught them? The ship docked in Cherbourg on November 15, 1945, the same port where their journey had begun 8 months earlier. But everything was different now. The women who stumbled down the gangplank were not the same women who had been loaded onto transport ships in March. They carried the same bodies, wore the same gray dresses, stamped with PW, but something fundamental had shifted inside them. Germany was unrecognizable. The train journey from France to Hamburg took 4 days through landscape that looked like the surface of the moon. Cities reduced to rubble, bridges destroyed, refugees walking along railroad tracks carrying everything they owned on their backs, children with hollow eyes begging for food at every station. Greta Hoffmann pressed her face against the train window and wept. She had known intellectually that Germany was destroyed. The letters had described it. But seeing it was different. This was what Nazi ideology had brought them. This wasteland of broken stone and broken lives was the final product of 12 years of hatred and war. Hamburg was worse than she had imagined. Her family's apartment building was gone, replaced by a crater filled with stagnant water. She found her sister Ingrid living in a basement 3 kilometers away, sharing space with 2 other families. The reunion was tearful, but strange. Ingrid looked at her sister with eyes that had seen too much. "You look healthy," Ingrid said. It was almost an accusation. "The Americans fed us well," Greta admitted. She felt guilty saying it. Guilty for having eaten eggs and bacon while her sister starved. Guilty for having slept in clean beds while her country burned. Guilty for everything. The first weeks were devoted to survival, finding food, finding shelter, finding work in a city where there was no work to be found. The British occupation forces were organizing cleanup crews, paying in rations rather than worthless Reichsmarks. Greta joined a crew clearing rubble from what had been the city center. She worked alongside women who had been teachers, lawyers, musicians. Now they were all the same. Survivors in a graveyard moving stones from one pile to another. But even in those desperate early days, something marked Greta as different. The other women complained constantly about the occupation forces, about British arrogance, about American naivety, about the unfairness of being treated as criminals when they were just ordinary Germans who had done what they were told. Greta did not complain. When someone mentioned that Black American soldiers were stationed in the American zone, someone else made a crude joke about animals in uniform. Greta walked away from the conversation. She could not explain what she had experienced. She did not have words that these women would understand. But she knew she could never laugh at that joke. She knew something they did not know. And that knowledge separated her from everyone around her. It took 2 years for Germany to stabilize enough for normal life to resume. By 1947, schools were reopening. Teachers were desperately needed, especially teachers who could pass the denazification screening. Greta Hoffmann had never been a party member. Her work as a Red Cross nurse was considered humanitarian rather than military. She passed the screening and was assigned to a secondary school in Hamburg, teaching history to teenagers who had grown up knowing nothing but war. This is where her transformation found its purpose. The official curriculum for post-war Germany emphasized democracy, tolerance, and the crimes of the Nazi regime. But most teachers delivered these lessons mechanically, without conviction, treating them as requirements to be fulfilled rather than truths to be internalized. Greta taught differently. She told her students about Camp Concordia. She described the black soldiers who had guarded her with dignity and professionalism. She explained how everything she had been taught about race had been proven wrong by simple human contact. She made them understand that propaganda was poison, that it could make ordinary people believe monstrous lies, that the only defense was to think for themselves and question what they were told. Some parents complained. They called her a traitor, a collaborator, someone who had been brainwashed by the enemy. The school administrators received letters demanding her dismissal. But Greta had allies too. Other teachers who had lived through the war and come to similar conclusions. Former soldiers who had seen enough death to know that ideology was not worth dying for. and slowly, quietly, a network formed. Teachers across Hamburg who were committed to raising a different generation. It was not easy. For every student who absorbed the lessons, there were 3 who resisted. The old beliefs were comfortable. They provided easy answers to complicated questions. They allowed people to feel superior without accomplishing anything. But Greta persisted. Year after year, class after class, she planted seeds of doubt in young minds. She could not know which seeds would grow. She could only keep planting. 6,000 miles away, James Wilson returned to Georgia in January 1946. He had served his country for 5 years. He had fought in North Africa and Italy. He had been wounded, decorated, and assigned to guard duty that most white soldiers considered beneath them. He had helped transform the beliefs of women who had been taught to see him as subhuman. None of it mattered in Macon, Georgia. The Jim Crow laws that had governed his childhood were still in full force. He could not eat in white restaurants. He could not drink from white water fountains. He could not vote. He had helped defeat fascism in Europe, and he came home to find fascism alive and well in America. But Wilson was not the same man who had left Georgia in 1941. The war had changed him. Camp Concordia had changed him. He had seen that minds could change, that beliefs could shift, that even people raised on hatred could learn to see differently. If German women could transform, why not Americans? He became a teacher like Greta, though he did not know it. He taught in segregated schools, where black children learned from outdated textbooks discarded by white schools. He taught them to think critically, to question what they were told, to believe in their own worth, despite a society that denied it. And when the civil rights movement began to build in the 1950s, Wilson was ready. He joined the WWII. He organized voter registration drives despite threats and intimidation. He marched and protested and went to jail for demanding rights that should have been his birthright. In 1963, he traveled to Washington for the March on Washington. He stood among 250,000 people and listened to Martin Luther King Jr. speak about a dream of racial equality. And he thought about a pine tree in Louisiana, about conversations with a German nurse who had learned to see him as human, about the possibility that change was real. He never knew what happened to Greta Hoffman. He never knew that she was teaching German students about him at the same time he was teaching American students about her. He never knew that on 2 continents, 2 people who had met as enemies were fighting the same battle against the same ignorance. But perhaps he sensed it. Perhaps he understood that the conversations under that pine tree had rippled outward in ways neither of them could trace. Robert Hayes continued his military career after the war. He served in Korea, leading a company of black soldiers in some of the fiercest fighting of that conflict. He was promoted to major, then lieutenant colonel, then colonel. Each promotion came harder than it would have for a white officer. Each step required proving himself twice over, 3 times over, against prejudice that persisted despite his service. He retired in 1968, just as the military was finally beginning to integrate in meaningful ways. The barriers he had spent his career fighting were starting to fall. Black officers were being promoted to general. Black soldiers were serving alongside white soldiers without the fiction of separate but equal. Hayes kept a box of letters in his study. Letters from German women who had been held at Camp Concordia. Letters thanking him for his leadership, describing the changes they had undergone, updating him on their lives in post-war Germany. One letter received in 1952 was from Greta Hoffman. She wrote about her teaching career, about the resistance she faced, about her determination to raise a generation of Germans who would never repeat the mistakes of their parents. She asked if he remembered her. She asked if he thought any of it had mattered. Hayes wrote back. He told her that of course it mattered, that every mind changed was a victory, that history was made not by grand gestures, but by countless small acts of courage and conviction, that she should keep teaching, keep speaking truth, keep believing that human beings could learn to be better. They corresponded for 30 years until Hayes died in 1989. His family found the letters after his passing and donated them to a military archive. They are there, still a record of an unlikely friendship forged in the crucible of war and maintained across decades and continents. What happened at Camp Concordia was not unique. Across the United States, over 400,000 German prisoners of war were held in more than 500 camps during the final years of World War II. Many of these camps were staffed by black soldiers, particularly in the segregated South. And in many of these camps, similar transformations occurred. German prisoners arrived expecting brutality and found professionalism. They arrived believing in racial hierarchy and encountered evidence that contradicted everything they had been taught. They left America carrying questions that would shape the rest of their lives. Historians estimate that German POWs who were held in America returned home with significantly different attitudes than those held in British or French camps. They had seen a functioning democracy, flawed but real. They had experienced a multiracial society that challenged Nazi ideology at its core. They had been treated according to the Geneva Convention by a nation that could have chosen revenge. This mattered for denazification. The official programs of re-education were necessary, but limited. They could force compliance without creating conviction. They could make people say the right words without believing them. But the personal experiences of POWs could reach deeper. They could create genuine doubt, genuine questioning, genuine change. The women of Camp Concordia were a small part of this larger story. Perhaps 200 women out of millions who participated in the Nazi system. Perhaps a few dozen who truly transformed and carried that transformation forward. Perhaps a handful who devoted their lives to fighting the ideology they had once embraced. But history is made by handfuls. Movements are built by individuals who refuse to accept the world as it is. Change happens when enough people decide to live differently. One person at a time, one conversation at a time, one moment of recognition at a time. Here is a detail that almost nobody knows. In 1975, 30 years after the war ended, a reunion was organized at the site of the former Camp Concordia. The barracks were long gone, the land returned to farming, but a historical marker had been placed at the entrance. Survivors gathered from across America and Germany. Former guards now in their 60s. Former prisoners, now grandmothers. They came to remember, to reconnect, to see if the bonds formed in that strange interlude still held. Greta Hoffmann made the journey from Hamburg. She was 62 years old, retired from teaching, a widow with 3 grown children and 5 grandchildren. She had never returned to America since her repatriation in 1945. She did not know what she would find. What she found was James Wilson. He was 67, retired from teaching himself, a veteran of the civil rights movement, with scars both visible and invisible. He had almost not come to the reunion. What was the point of revisiting a past that most people wanted to forget? But something had pulled him back to Louisiana, back to the pine forests, back to the place where he had first believed that change was possible. They recognized each other immediately. 30 years had passed, but some things do not change. The way someone holds themselves, the way someone looks at the world, the way someone carries truth in their eyes. They sat on a bench near where the pine tree had been. It was gone now, cut down when the camp was demolished, but they found the approximate spot. And they talked as they had talked so many years before. Greta told him about her teaching career, about the students she had reached and the ones she had failed to reach, about her children and grandchildren who had grown up in a Germany that was trying imperfectly but genuinely to be different from the Germany of her youth. Wilson told her about the civil rights movement, about the marches and the beatings and the slow, painful progress toward equality, about the students he had taught and the minds he had changed, about his own children and grandchildren who lived in an America that was trying imperfectly but genuinely to live up to its ideals. They discovered that they had been fighting the same battle on different continents. They discovered that the conversations under the pine tree had shaped both their lives in ways they had never fully understood. They discovered that mercy once extended ripples outward forever. "We changed each other," Greta said. "You changed me first," Wilson replied. "No." She shook her head. "You gave me a chance to change myself. You believed I could be better when I had given you no reason to believe it. That was the gift. I just tried to be worthy of it." They sat in silence as the Louisiana evening gathered around them. Fireflies were beginning to pulse in the darkness, just as they had 30 years before. The world had changed enormously since 1945, and yet this moment felt exactly the same. Two people from opposite sides of history, finding common ground in the simple recognition of each other's humanity. This is the story of Camp Concordia. Not a story of grand battles or famous generals. Not a story that changed the course of the war. But a story that matters nonetheless. Because history is not only made by the powerful, it is made by ordinary people who choose in small moments to be better than they were taught to be. Greta Hoffman was a nurse who believed the lies of her government until she met people who contradicted those lies. James Wilson was a soldier who served a country that oppressed him until he chose to believe that countries like people could change. Robert Hayes was an officer who demanded dignity for his prisoners because he understood that dignity is not earned but inherent. Together in a small camp in the Louisiana pine forests, they proved something that matters more than any military victory. They proved that hatred is learned and can be unlearned. They proved that propaganda loses its power when confronted with reality. They proved that mercy is not weakness, but strength. They proved that human beings can change. The women who left Camp Concordia in November 1945 carried a fragile truth back to Germany. Not all of them held on to it. Not all of them lived by it. The pressure to conform, to forget, to return to comfortable hatred was immense. But some of them remembered. Some of them taught their children differently. Some of them spoke up when others were silent. And Germany today, for all its imperfections, is not the Germany of 1945. Something changed. Perhaps it changed one person at a time, one conversation at a time, one moment of recognition at a time. Perhaps it changed because of a jazz concert on a Louisiana evening. Perhaps it changed because of a sergeant who sat on a bench and asked a simple question. Perhaps it changed because of a captain who saluted defeated enemies as they left his camp. If you know similar stories of unlikely connection and transformation, share them in the comments. History is full of moments like Camp Concordia. Moments when enemies became something else. Moments when hatred yielded to understanding. These stories matter because they prove that the worst of human nature is not the only possibility. And here is the truth that echoes across 80 years. Humanity is not determined by race, nation, or ideology. It is chosen daily in small acts of decency. It is proven by how we treat those we have power over. It is built by people who, having every reason to hate, choose something better instead. That is the lesson of Camp Concordia. That is the legacy of Greta Hoffman and James Wilson and Robert Hayes. That is the hope that remains when everything else has been destroyed. And that is why this story was worth telling.